Good morning, everybody. My name is Trevor Donnellan from Teagasc, which is the Agricultural Research Institute in Ireland, and I'm joined today as well by my colleague Emma Dillon and our colleague Paula Palma, who did most of the work on this particular part of the project, is unable to join us, unfortunately, for personal reasons, but just want to make sure we acknowledge her contribution to this. So what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about a case study that used the intervention logic. And as you know, the intervention logic is, apologies now, my slides aren't advancing for some reason. Yeah, stuck. Oh, okay, I think it's going now. Can you see the next slide?
Yes, it's fine now, Trevor. Yeah.
Okay. So as I was saying, we were using the intervention logic, and those of you who are familiar with the basis for CAP strategic plans will be familiar with that intervention logic term. It's one of the steps that is to be taken in the development of a national CAP strategic plan. So in this particular example, the case study was looking at Ireland, obviously, and taking a national approach. We don't have a regional dimension to our CAP planning in Ireland. And I suppose the question then, for those who might be less familiar with an intervention logic, what exactly is it? Well, it's a qualitative tool which results in a visual map that explains the overall concept behind an intervention. And as you'll see in the next slide, the interventions we have in mind here are interventions under the Common Agricultural Policy, so specific measures under the Common Agricultural Policy. So what you do with an intervention logic is you begin with an identified problem, which then creates a motivation for some form of policy action, and that then ultimately, through your intervention logic, is supposed to lead to some expected outcomes and impact. So your intervention logic essentially explains how the intervention is expected to work. One of the things also that the intervention logic provides you with is a basis for identifying outcomes or impacts that should be monitored and evaluated. And if you know what those things are, then you can start to think about what kind of indicators, what kind of data would be useful to be able to measure the effectiveness of the policy that has been chosen. So in our particular case, as I was saying, the case study reflected back on the current CAP programming period under this new delivery model that's in place for the CAP running from 2023 to 2027. Member states are required to report on the effectiveness of their the interventions that are in their CAP strategic plans. And how well those interventions contribute to the various CAP objectives. You'll be familiar with the 10 CAP objectives that currently exist, which have economic, environmental, and social aspects to them. And this is all part of what's called the Performance and Monitoring Evaluation Framework. And that framework basically has a set of performance indicators associated with it, and those indicators fall into 4 categories. We have output indicators, results indicators, context indicators, and impact indicators. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into detail about what those are, but I think many of you on the call will be already familiar with that concept. So in this intervention logic case study, we were focusing on the direct payment interventions, essentially payments that are made under Pillar 1 of the Common Agricultural Policy, and also the ANC measure under Pillar 2. So those were the payments that we decided to focus on in the interests of making the case study tractable, given the time that we had to do it. Also, as part of the case study, we set out to try to see if we could propose additional indicators that could be used for the measurement of the effectiveness of policy from a monitoring and evaluation aspect. And this was something that was emphasised to us in discussions with the Department of Agriculture, the Agriculture Ministry in Ireland, that they were quite interested in learning whether new types of indicators could be developed that would demonstrate the usefulness of agricultural support. So the intervention logic, what did we expect this to actually do for us in the end, this case study, ultimately to provide us with the evidence of the wide range of benefits provided by these support payments in terms of a range of different outcomes in terms of food security, risk management, income volatility. You can come up with quite an extensive list there. And ultimately to help us to see whether we could develop new types of performance indicators that could actually be operationalized at some point in the future. The intervention logic, as I said, the intervention logic explains how the intervention is supposed to actually work, and while we're talking about the Common Agricultural Policy here, you could apply this very narrowly to a very specific part of a policy framework or a strategy or whatever. Its use isn't confined to looking at issues in the Common Agricultural Policy by any means. And while it's most common, I suppose, to apply an intervention logic at the planning stage when you're coming up with trying to come up with policies that you might want to actually implement, it's also of relevance in terms of the implementation stage and even in the evaluation stage as well. So if my colleague Paula was here today, she'd be trying to emphasize that you could almost think of an intervention logic as a kind of a living document if you wanted to, and something that could be revisited on a periodic basis. That you shouldn't simply imagine it to be something that you do when you're developing a policy and then that you forget about it completely afterwards. That's not the idea. In terms of stakeholder engagement, I already mentioned the Agriculture Ministry in Ireland, and we had quite a productive initial discussion with them, which gave us, I suppose, some of the insights they had in terms of what they might find useful coming out of a case study like this. The case study was kind of predetermined, but we wanted to, I guess, tweak it in whatever way as possible to try and produce something that ultimately might be more useful and have practical relevance at a later point. And we also had a series of workshops with researchers. Principally there, what we were trying to do is to come up with ideas for new indicators. And we were particularly interested in trying to come up with ideas for new indicators that didn't involve new rounds of data collection. One of the challenges I guess we have with indicators is that you could probably dream up great indicators to measure the performance of agriculture, but the question that would arise is how costly or how practical might it be to try and collect data with respect to those indicators. So if it's at all possible to develop new indicators based off existing data sets, then that's something that we were very interested to see whether that might be possible. There was also an extensive literature review took place to help in the design of the intervention logic diagram. And as I said, the stakeholder engagement helped to inform the design of what might be potentially future feasible indicators, and also helped in identifying where there are data gaps that actually remain and might require us to think a bit more under frameworks such as the Farm Sustainability Data Network about how we could fill those gaps at some future point. Okay, so what were the key results of the case study? So having developed the intervention logic, we feel it shows how Ireland's main support payments contribute to outcomes across a range of different areas, including farm income stability, capacity to look at income distribution, generational renewal, environmental sustainability, these kind of issues. We also came up with a set of proposed indicators which could better help to monitor outcomes. And as I said, the idea behind this was to try to harness as best as possible the data that already exists in the Irish FSDN, which is called the National Farm Survey, because our goal was at the outset to try to avoid having to specifically collect new pieces of data if we felt that was at all possible. I think another point coming through from the case study is that the whole intervention logic development process can be a useful communication tool and an evaluation tool as well for the Agriculture Ministry, in that it can be used to help to explain how interventions are expected to work, identifying what outcomes should be monitored, and what indicators ultimately would be needed to assess the effectiveness of policy. So what did we learn ultimately? Well, I think what came through from the intervention logic exercise from the point of view of what policymakers and practitioners might be interested in is that it's important to assess our CAP support payments, the direct payments in this particular example, in a way that recognises that their role goes beyond merely farm income support. While that's often advertised as the core benefit of having these payments, the intervention logic demonstrates that there are wider contributions to CAP objectives beyond farm income support arising out of the payment of those supports. So with that in mind, I think future policy design could better reflect, I suppose, that contribution to these wider objectives by having a broader set of indicators assessing the effectiveness of these support payments. Another thing coming through from the development of the intervention logic is that it provides a clear basis, I guess, for measuring whether support payments are achieving policy objectives. Another thing that comes through from the case study is that it can also help to identify where policies potentially overlap with each other, and also where there may be policy gaps, and where potentially in the future more targeted measures may be needed. And in that context, thinking about for example, particular groups within agriculture, such as farmers with small farms or farms in disadvantaged areas or farms that are operated by younger farmers. What worked well in creating the intervention logic, I think, is certainly is something that's useful for helping policymakers to make clearer links between specific measures and specific outcomes. And I think also it highlights the importance of involving a broad community of stakeholders early in the process, so that those links can be traced through and potentially trade-offs or whatever might be captured as well. And it also emphasizes, I think, the intervention logic, the need for better areas, in better data, I should say, in particular areas. If we had our time again, what might we do differently? Well, we had planning to have a follow-up engagement with the Agriculture Ministry to review the intervention logic, and for a variety of reasons, we didn't manage to organise that, and that's something that we could still potentially have going forward. So we didn't have quite the amount of feedback that we had from the Agriculture Ministry as we had originally planned, but that was our fault, really, in terms of us underestimating how much time it would take to develop the intervention logic itself. We also had two very useful workshops with researchers to get feedback on indicator development, and we hadn't envisaged those at the beginning of the process, but it's something that emerged as being potentially very useful and important as we went through the process. So we managed to convene a group on a couple of occasions to talk through what kind of indicators might be relevant and what might be feasible also based on the data that currently exists. If we had more time, or if we were repeating this process, I think what we would do is we would have devoted more time to it, because developing the intervention logic and engaging with the full range of stakeholders in the development process, I think we underestimated how much time was required for that. And then I think, yeah, that's my last main slide, and this is a little quick look at the actual intervention logic diagram, which we're not proposing to talk through, but there's an actual associated report that goes into more detail on this.